Hello, this is Property Matters, a weekly catch-up on the world of property, supported by Fairview International Property Consultancy and auctionproperty.co.uk. We're live every Sunday, 10 a.m, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and our website, propertymatterstv.co.uk. If you're watching on our website, please leave us that Google review. If you're watching via social media, get involved in the conversation. You know where to do that by now, I'm sure. Email address for suggested topics to discuss, hello@propertymatterstv.co.uk. If you can't catch us live every Sunday, get us on the move with a podcast available from the podcast platforms that you can see on the other side of the screen. And we're live, of course, across the week on Dilsey Radio. Let's say hi to our property expert, Joe Joshi. Hi, Joe.
Hi, good morning, Paul. Good morning to everybody. Good morning to our viewers and listeners, wherever you are, and hope you're having a good, restful Sunday.
Couple of weeks into the into the election campaigning, should I say, and it has to be said that property has not reared its ugly head until now. And this is the week where suddenly we've got onto the housing market. Not sure why it's taken quite so long to come to the top of the pile, but nonetheless, Labour says it's going to continue with the mortgage guarantee scheme, which of course has been run and was due to run until next year for the Tory party. It's going to be called and rebranded as Freedom to Buy. And the party, the Labour Party that is, estimates that the policy would help 80,000 more young people onto the housing ladder over the next 5 years. It would make permanent the current mortgage guarantee scheme, which helps people get a mortgage with low deposits, which was due to expire next year. It's also announced that Labour would also commit to an overhaul of the planning system if it wins next month's general election, including reintroducing housing targets, with Sir Keir Starmer claiming his measures will see 1.5 million more homes built over the next 5 years. Similar target to what we used to see from the Tory party, of course, Joe, when they were promising 300,000 new houses every year and not getting anywhere near it, frankly. So this is more of the same, really, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. There's nothing different there. I mean, he just rebranded the Help to Buy scheme to Freedom to what they call it now, Freedom to Buy scheme. So, he's just playing on words there more than anything else. The policies and the politics are not particularly going to change. And I'm not particularly sure that all those numbers and targets that he's actually setting out are true. I think they're just political speech at the moment. And once he gets his feet under the table, and I think you'll find that the whole of this will just become another thing that they talked about in the distant past. Neither of these parties, in all honesty, are been supported, but yet what you have to remember, Paul, is that it's the housing market through the difficult times that have always supported all of these successive governments, successive politicians. When it comes to get tough and things get difficult, they've got to build their way out, and that's what they've done. And we know that, for example, when we look back at the pandemic time, everything else was down, and it was only the building that was going on. It was the house prices that went up, and it was that kept everything afloat. So 300 homes every year for the next 5 years is, we haven't managed to get it done so far. So I'm not sure where he's going to magic this from at all. There's certainly the Freedom to Buy scheme that he wants to launch is basically the Help to Buy scheme. And those that did or don't understand the Help to Buy, or perhaps even the Freedom to Buy scheme, it was basically a 5% deposit from the potential buyer, a 10% donation. Sorry, let me rephrase. 10% loan from the government and a 10% input from the builder. It was only good for new homes. It was not made or designed for second homes. So new homes, the developer had already built in that money, that cushion in the pricing. So there was no particular favors in that, other than the fact that somebody could get started on that ladder with a 5%. The 10% comes from the government, and the government will turn around and say that they would, if your house price went up over the next 5 years, you would have to pay a proportion of the uplift of that as a payment back to the government for the 10%. So theoretically, they had a stake in your capital gain, capital appreciation of the value of your property. And it's a similar situation for the builder. The builder locked his money into that, and felt that he could probably, over a longer period, get a good return back. So if you had a block of flats of 100 flats, for argument's sake, and you had a 10% stake in each one of those, still you got some money now, and then you got money in the future, or when somebody sold that property, and you got a gain from that. So that's how those schemes worked. But unfortunately, it wasn't easy for all of the people to get the 5% that they wanted, and then they had to get a lender to allow them to lend money based on their circumstances, criteria, and see if they were successful in getting a mortgage.
Well, today the average first-time buyer is putting down 20% of the value of the property as a deposit. If you come into London, this goes up to almost 33%, or around £145,000. Over the last 5 years, less than 1% of mortgage lending to first-time buyers has been over the 95% loan-to-value, with 20% of new loans between 90 and 95% loan-to-value. So a vast majority of them are putting down 20% or more. FCA data shows that in 2022, there were 76,000 first-time buyer mortgages over 90% loan-to-value. The use of a mortgage guarantee means banks can reduce the cost of the mortgage with a small deposit. While the mortgage rate may be lower, these borrowers will still need to prove they can pay a stressed mortgage rate at a higher level than the actual rate they will pay, which currently averages over 8%. So really, you've still got to have a pretty good income to be able to qualify for a scheme like this, haven't you?
It's not just the income, it's also the stability of the job that you're doing and the type of works that you're doing. I mean, there was a time when self-employed people were able to write their own self-certification. That's not there now. So, you have to have a robust position, both income-wise and also from the type of jobs that you're doing, to give that bank that guarantee, that assurance that you're going to be good. The stress tests are done on the basis of higher rates. So, I mean, if you imagine, as you say, 8% of that, that in itself can be a destroyer of any chance getting a mortgage. So it's almost better not to have these schemes, because people do want to go onto these schemes at 5%. But the reality is, it's actually cheaper to have a bigger deposit. So probably easier to go to Bank of Mum and Dad, which has been the famous bank, and say, look, I need a bigger deposit, or they need to refinance their property and get a bigger deposit, and they will have a cheaper mortgage. Otherwise, at 95%, you are going to be paying not only the bigger, the smaller deposit, but the bigger penalty for owning that mortgage.
They say that small deposit mortgages tend to work better in lower value housing markets, where the repayments on a 95% loan don't account for a high proportion of the buyer's income. They are much harder to make work in southern England, of course, where the affordability pressures on first-time buyers are greatest. Overall, it's welcome news, but the projected target will only account for 5% of first-time buyers. I mean, it's one of those policies, isn't it, where you think, oh, that's a good thing. Yeah, it's really good they're helping the first-time buyers. But actually, so few of them will even qualify for it in reality.
It's really a marketing policy, Paul. It's just another marketing ploy to say, here we are helping the first time buyers with the, low deposits and so forth. But in essence, in reality, none of that is actually going to come true. And such a low percentage that take it up. So I think it's more of a gimmick. I mean, they'd be better off, coming up with other schemes that will make it more interesting. And I just don't think those other schemes also include housing associations on a what they call a purchase, to be able to buy that by a share ownership. Sorry, that was the word I was looking for. A share ownership scheme, where a housing association own a share, and you could buy a share, or you can buy a discounted rate, but that discounted rate would actually be penalized on the sale. So there's always a clause in there that you've got to check, make sure that you actually don't, hang yourself in that situation.
Mr. Starmer's been, or Sir Starmer, should I say, has been quite bullish on his planning reforms and targets. He's, as I said earlier, 1.5 million homes in 5 years, or 300,000 a year. And also, of course, big changes. But this is just something that we've had for the last 14 years, and very little of it was done about it. And certainly nothing was ever really challenged by the Labour Party when the Tory Party were supposed to be doing all of this stuff. We didn't get anywhere near the numbers, did we?
Oh, it's an impossible task. As I said, this is just gilding the lily. They're just trying to make it sound good, but reality-wise, there is nothing in that box, nothing in that drawer that is different to what the Tories have done over the last 14 years in terms of housing. What they have done is actually given us 14 ministers for the housing, almost one different minister every year for them being in power. And they didn't stay long, and it's like a stepping stone. They'll look, I've got nothing, no job for you, so you go and become a housing minister. And half of them have probably not got a clue about what the housing situation is. They've abused it. I feel personally, really angry about the fact that they've always used and abused the housing market when it suits them. They could treat it like a yo-yo, the stamp duty, the interest rate, and so forth. And they're always playing with people's well-being, and people are genuinely interested in the housing market. They want to own their own home. They want to have a scheme and a structure to be able to, grow their families in these homes and so forth. But these ministers don't look at it in the same way as the people that want to buy it.
Labour also talking about prioritising domestic first-time buyers over international investors. People saying that's a welcome change. I had not read that bit, to be honest with you, but even on the rare occasions when housing has been permitted under the current government regime, all too often these have not actually provided opportunities for aspiring UK buyers to get onto the housing ladder. So, I mean, that is one thing, isn't it? Especially in London, I guess, because there is a huge attraction from international buyers to London, and no doubt they've got cash ready to spend in many cases. And the poor old first-time buyer who's struggling to find a mortgage is always going to be second best on that one.
Yeah, look, I mean, London is a unique scenario in itself. It is where everybody would like to be, but cannot be. First-time buyers, specifically, they've got a challenge. Their biggest challenge is international people, not only international investors, but international people who buy and invest for their children who come to education here, because the education system is applauded all over the world with good British universities and so forth behind. So those are the things that makes people sort of come into London, into the south. But people that live in London, that live and are part of the UK fabric, are going to find it challenging and hard to sort of get onto the property ladder at the prices they are in. So sometimes it's better to go out and then come back in, build yourself some sort of equity. So, for example, there might be other towns that you can commute, and the train systems have got better and better. I have to say, where people are now applauding the fact that the new lines have made life easier traveling a bit further up. We know that we benefited from the Elizabeth line that was finally got there, and now you can see the difference, and people say, okay, well, I could actually jump on that train and go out as far as Reading and probably still be in a good position to get to work in time. Yeah.
The Home Builders Federation has been talking about the very fact of planning, and they're detailing out what they'd like the next government to do. The plan, titled Home Building, an Engine for Growth, Prosperity and Opportunity, highlights the challenges facing the house building industry and sets out the measure it believes are crucial to addressing the nation's housing crisis. Housing supply As housing supply continues to plummet and the nation's housing crisis worsens, the HBF says that home builders are contending with a complex and cumbersome planning system, widespread and disproportionate moratoriums across a quarter of a century, across a quarter of the country rather, due to nutrient neutrality, customers unable to access affordable mortgage lending, and an uncertain policy environment. This combination has resulted in housing supply and industry confidence falling sharply, and builders unable to get spades in the ground and build homes at anywhere near the pace and scale required. They have a blueprint for the next government outlining priority policies for the industry, which we'll look at in a minute. But that's a good point, isn't it? I mean, we do need a simpler planning system. And there's also a suggestion we actually need more planners working in council offices, because there aren't enough of them to do the job, and so the process is slow.
Yes, I mean the planning system and the planning people, the staff that they've got. I mean, it's just because when the pandemic came, a lot of people started working from home, Paul, and people started thinking, well, I could actually do a majority of this from home. So a lot of the councils, the local councils, lost their own planning consultants. as consultants now, generally into the offices to see if they can work on them, and they just don't have the same hunger and impetus to put into the planning application. So you might get two or three planners who are not actually residents, who are not also part of the full team as a full-time employed person. They are just consultants that are brought in to deal with certain things and certain planning applications, and that makes life difficult. And puts a lot of pressure on them to do that, and so therefore that takes time. There's got to be a way of increasing the number of personnel, and most of that's got to be on the basis that they actually employ or bring in on people, bring new people on board or train them, but they don't do any of that either. So that's what causes the problem with the planning side, and that's what caused the delay.
So let's look at the HBF's blueprint for the next government. They're talking firstly about housing the nation, they say, Joe. Homes to meet the country's needs, including calls for a new targeted first-time buyer scheme, which we've already seen, action to resolve uncontracted Section 106 units, a requirement for local planning authorities to assess the demand for housing of older people, the expansion of green mortgages, and the abolishment of stamp duty for purchases of homes with an A or B EPC rating. Now that's an interesting one, isn't it? So if you've got an A or B EPC on your property, you don't pay any stamp duty. That would appeal, I suspect.
Well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not sure. A or a B is not a that's a positive. A C is the minimum. That's right. A C is the minimum. So that would certainly make it more interesting. But I cannot imagine that the Treasury would even think about losing stamp duty for A and B EPC passes. Stamp duty is something that is money for old ropes because everybody wants to move, everybody wants to try and get on the housing ladder. And I can't imagine in my wildest dreams that anybody at Treasury would say, well, actually, you know what, let's exempt everybody who's got A and B. That would be a great incentive for them to get their property up to A and B. But if it means that the people have paid money to get it up to A and B, I'm not sure that the government or the Treasury would want to actually give away money knowing that it's up. So I'm not really sure what that it will actually achieve, other than that fact that the Treasury won't earn as much money. And people may feel that that's the right thing to do. Let's get on there and buy. But of course, the old adage of supply and demand will kick in, and that is if the supply becomes limited, the demand is high, house prices will automatically go up, and that's what some of the governments have been trying to do, is to try and keep them at a steady level. That's been an impossible task, as we discussed over the last 50 years. It's not a challenge that is somebody's going to rise to that quickly. I think they could modify things a little bit more by offering some sort of reduction in stamp duties, or increasing the threshold of the value of the property. But to say, oh, we're not going to charge you for A and B passes, for argument's sake, would be actually shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Those stamp duty thresholds need to stay at 250 and not go back down to the 125, not with the way prices have been rising in recent years. They're talking about increasing housing supply. I know that's what everybody's been talking about, but they're largely saying what Labour have already said here, establishing a clearer and more certain policy landscape, including calls to reinstate mandatory housing targets and a 5-year housing land supply and the 5-year housing land supply reform of the standard method of housing need, the introduction of a 10-year plan for housing. I thought there was one anyway in most towns, and a review of the green belt. So I don't think there's anything really that we can disagree with there. Fixing the planning process, tackling the systemic issues hindering delivery, including calls to ring-fence planning application fees for planning purposes, increase the threshold for reserved matters submissions to be determined by committee, introduce a presumption of favour of development over small sites, and accelerate the implementation of national development management policies. There's no doubt about it that we do need to get things more streamlined and get the builders the opportunity to get the spades in the sand, as they were saying earlier.
Yeah, look, I mean, all of the above is right, and it's doable, and it should be done. But unfortunately, it's not something that's going to happen in a heartbeat. It's, in my mind, this is purely political talk about things that they think they want to do. We know that the planning application system needs to be reformed. The biggest issue in all of the planning, I think, is really bit of a smokescreen. The real issue, Paul, is that it is impossible to build the properties at the prices that they are now being quoted. This week alone, I had a site sent to me. It's a perfectly good site, lots of homes. The value of it, in the old days, we would used to use it as a third, and third. So it's the third land, third build cost, and third potential profit. I mean, the build cost of this particular project was 30 million. The purchase price is £6 million. So there's all of that whole, adage of third is gone out of the window because the build cost is just beyond control. It's impossible. I mean, we're talking about building at the very minimum at £200 a square foot now.
It's interesting as they're talking about the unblocking of the housing pipeline, finding a resolution to nutrient neutrality, including calls to bring forward legislation to unblock 160,000 homes currently on hold due to Natural England's disproportionate mitigations. So that's the nutrient neutrality thing is basically where the builder has got an obligation to make sure that they don't make the site more polluted than it was before they built there. And that's suggesting there, from what they're saying, that there is a block because of Natural England's mitigations. There's 160,000 new homes not being built because they've got a problem with it.
Well, yes, with Natural England, conservation areas, Grade 2 listing, Grade 1 listing, all of these type of historical situations do cause a problem in planning, do cause a problem with those properties. At the same time, there is a whole bunch of areas and planning and applications that can be made for what we call just ordinary good old fashioned family homes or first time buy, and that can take as long and if not longer sometimes just because it doesn't meet. I mean, for example, recently there was an application in an area where they just turned around and said, well, yes, we want more homes and we want to do it, but the people that lived there didn't want it because it was going to cause a problem for their views. So, you can try and get it in one side, but then it's the same people that are saying we can't get our planning permission through in time that are actually objecting for applications to happen because they don't want the building to be in their backyard. So, it's not an easy policy to change, I think.
They're also talking about building greener homes, of course, and calls to develop a roadmap for the talent pipeline needed to deliver low carbon sustainable housing, publish the outcome and implement the recommendations of the Industrial Training Board review, reform of the apprentice levy, and implement the Competition and Market Authority's recommendations for a single mandatory industry consumer code and access to new homes ombudsman for all new build buyers. So that's basically, I mean, this is the difficult thing I was going to say to you about, the lacking or the reduction of stamp duty for EPC A and B. The trouble is, if you don't do that, for example, what incentives can you put in place that will be appealing to everybody to try and get the whole industry building greener and people buying greener?
Well, the first thing they're going to have to do is find a resource of cheaper materials. I mean, materials are now just so exorbitant in cost that a reverse gear is going to be near impossible. So they're going to have to learn to accept it. The second thing is, of course, you want to build these houses and these promises. You just get them to be more realistic. These building costs and things are just unrealistic. So they'll just be something that they talked about and continue to talk about and just left in the drawer because nobody will actually be able to do that in terms of building. And the third thing is, I think before they start lobbing things down and building, we know that there is an abundance of properties lying empty, vacant, or derelict, which probably could be brought back into use and be more effective and in nicer areas sometimes than you think you got in the first place.
Yeah, and our final story goes on to Property Mark, who are lobbying about commercial property this week. They're urging political parties to campaigning for people's votes in July's general election to commit to simplifying commercial planning applications. They have also requested that politicians should provide more clarity over how local authorities auction commercial property under the High Street Rentals auctions brought in via the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. Regarding decarbonisation, the UK government must introduce grants to support commercial landlords with meeting their decarbonisation targets and to roll out the advice service nationally. They wrote to and then later met with the Secretary of State for Energy, Security and Net Zero earlier this year to establish if the Prime Minister's amendments to the UK's government minimum energy efficiency standards for the private rented sector that were ended last September apply to commercial agents. Commercial property in England and Wales must hit energy efficiency targets of Energy Performance Certification B by 2030, with a significant target for B and C by 2028, which moved forward from 2027. So again, there is pressure on commercial landlords, and I guess they're going to have to do the same thing to bring those properties up to scratch from that side as well.
Well, I mean, the thing with these properties that need EPC ratings and so forth, and landlords bringing them up to scratch in order to be able to rent them or sell them or be auctioned for the best rents, it's always an investment of some sort. And if anything, any government can do. Back in the days, they used to have grants available from local authorities to upgrade their house, and at a much lower percentage of borrowing than perhaps going to the bank or the building society. And maybe that's what they've got to bring back, Paul. They've got to bring back some facilities and funding locally, and they can get that repaid once they've done the property up and then sold it. Of course, I think it was 3 or 5 years at the time that they used to have to sort of keep them and then be able to refinance them. So I think there's lots of other schemes that could be considered. And if the Labour government or the Tories, if they are successful, they need to get people that are in the business around the table, as opposed to picking up some minister that they found that hasn't got a portfolio and then just stick him in the housing market.
They're also saying that they would welcome a business rates cut, which is the tax obviously paid on properties like shops to reduce the number of vacant buildings. And it's also suggested that a database of current permitted users for commercial property should be created for each commercial property should have the current permitted use. And on that point of business rates, Joe, to be perfectly honest, it's not necessarily the business rates as much as the fact that landlords still seem to want to be greedy, particularly in sort of historic town centres where they think they're ancient units which no doubt need plenty of renovation and restoration, seem to think that the rents that they want to charge are economic, but they're simply not, are they?
Well, landlords are stuck in a rock and a hard place as well, to some extent, because interest rates went up so high that they don't want to try and upset their existing tenants, because they'd rather keep them. Because the minute you get them vacant and you start them at the higher rate, the problem is you're not going to get the quality of the tenant. So part of it is the landlord's issue, but the bigger part of it is, of course, the system and the country and the planning. So that's where it takes time. That's where people can end up waiting for anything between 8 and 10 weeks for an application to go through, which they can use. But there is some merit in all these shops and things that are lying empty everywhere, that they should be brought back into use. But the problem is, will they be brought back into use into a clever way, or is it just something they'll say, okay, well, it got half a dozen shops empty, let's just allow them to turn it into residential or something else, and then you get another ghetto in a high street where people look at those and say, well, actually, well, it's not the best place, but it's a place to put my head down. It's in the high street. High street is the focus of any town, and therefore they shouldn't have such properties made available, read and in auction for somebody that is not qualified to deal with it in the right way, ends up owning it or living in it.
They were saying that the use of buildings for a different purpose than it was originally planned, those buying or leasing a commercial property may need to request permission first. Many local councils have established online planning portals that enable developers to read a building's planning history. Building purposes are categorised into use classes, which means that if the new purpose lands into the same use class as the existing purpose, you may not need to request planning permission. Anyone can request planning permission from a local council, of course, regardless of who owns the property, land or buildings. However, the legal owner of the site must be formally notified of the plans. Once a planning application is submitted, it can take up to 8 weeks to decide, but it can take even longer. And after receiving royal assent on the 26th of October last year, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act provided measures to regenerate England's empty high streets. Part 10 of the Act means that local councils would have a discretionary power to mandate auctions of specific empty high street premises, such that a landlord would be obliged to issue a tenancy to a successful bidder, also known as high street rental auctions, which Property Mark was supported of. So that looks like that's going to be enforced even more in the future to ensure that we get people in our shops.
Well, in our former shops, yes, and also perhaps opportunity for businesses to come to the town at, as you say, auction bid rental values. But the problem with that's going to be, it's not going to be your branded quality shops that are going to come to the town, which people mostly want to go to. They're going to be your local shops, local trader, which of course is as important, but unfortunately they never have the same panache as putting a high street together as the bigger boys do, and so therefore it's attracting the wrong customers and the wrong kind of people. But I think it's a good idea in the main. It's just that it needs to be rethought about strongly before they turn around and say, yeah, it's acceptable.
Yeah, they're saying that they're not sure what and how these auctions are going to work. They're saying currently the planning process takes too long and this thwarts economic regeneration when it should be doing the opposite. Furthermore, the system is held up by local authorities refusing to confirm current use class, meaning businesses looking to occupy commercial property are held up by having to apply for planning permission to confirm they can currently use the property for their type of business. A database or something attached to land registry or the valuation office would help greatly. Seems like common sense to me. So it's interesting, isn't it? We've got quite a busy week with the election focusing on property, and to add to that, you've got the Tory party saying that they will freeze things like capital gains and inheritance tax. Labour refusing to rule out any change to those amounts. And I noticed actually on the debate the other night on the television that the Green Party was suggesting that these luxury taxes, such as those paying inheritance tax or capital gains tax, should be even higher because they're luxuries. Interesting thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think when they start talking about luxury, it alienates a whole bunch of people in the marketplace. So, you're then sort of looking at a very small percentage of people that are going to be considering a luxury situation. But I think generally, using all the facilities and the planning changes that can happen is very, very important to bring in now. Planning is so long stretched out, sometimes it's not necessary. And the other issue is that will it become more attractive for people to have empty shops for a while so that they can go and get the planning and make it perhaps a residential or another use? One of the key things about high streets is that they've got to be attractive. They've got to be a visit somewhere to go to, rather than say I don't want to go there because it now looks like a ghetto. So it's a real challenge to make sure that balance is held correctly.
And that's where we must leave it for this week. Thank you very much indeed, Joe, as always. Join us for another Property Matters very soon.